Hello and welcome to the first episode of Signposts, Arouca Press's podcast where we delve into our books and contemporary issues with our very own authors. I'm Julian Kwasniewski, Assistant Editor and Marketing Director at Arouca Press. And today I'm happy to be hosting Leila Marie Lawler, one of our best-selling authors. Wife, mother, grandmother, she is also an author, and her book with Arouca, God Has No Grandchildren, a guided reading of Pius XI's encyclical Casti Connubii on Chaste Marriage, will be our specific topic today, although I'm sure we'll be talking about some of her other work too. Leila is the author of a popular blog, Like Mother, Like Daughter, and much of the wisdom from this blog was recently published by Sophia Press in a 3-volume set entitled Summa Domestica. We published the first edition of God Has No Grandchildren a few years ago, and it has been one of Arouca's bestsellers, now available in a second expanded edition. Leila, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and the themes you focused on in your writing and how you came to reflect on them?
Well, I am a convert to the faith, and someone, my parents were divorced when I was very young, and I'm someone who really struggled through the turmoil of, I was a young child in the 60s and a young adult in the 70s, and really was battered about by all the ideologies that were going on at the time, especially feminism, progressivism, just all sorts of things that were reflected in my personal life as well. Just being a child of divorce and having no sense of rootedness and just searching without knowing I was searching and so on. And I came to the faith through various means that God's grace, just through my reading and through mainly also meeting the man who is going to become my husband, Phil Lawler, who also was a cradle Catholic coming back to his faith, and so was very open to talking to me and suggesting things for me to read. I always credit, like so many converts, I'm not alone in this, I do credit C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton for opening up for me the world of objective truth primarily, which was so withheld from me as a child, and the world of beauty that I will say my parents did value beauty and did separately insist on beauty, and that was very important to me, but it was Christianity that put that beauty into context for me. So I became a wife and a mother at a young age because my husband's actually 10 years older than I am, so I did get married when I was pretty young. I was 19. I was determined, I was on one track of certainly becoming a typical feminist woman. I was going to an elite college. I was going to go to grad school. I was going to do all these things and have a career. But at the same time, my heart was just, I wanted to marry this man. And very shortly, I'm kind of a person who just does kind of do what I want to do. And I just wanted to have children. So I did that, much to the consternation of the people around me, because I just didn't think that it was worth my while to pay, especially pay for college. So I said, I can read these books. I don't need to be in college. So I did that, and we started our family, and I quickly realized that abstract ideas don't really get you through when you are faced with babies and toddlers. You need something more. And then I ended up having to pull myself up by my bootstraps. As an only child of divorced parents, I had very, very little practical experience with homemaking and even children. And I think I was in the situation that many people are in today of basically never having seen a baby or having very little interaction with babies until actually having a baby, which is kind of a nightmare. I mean, you really have no clue. So, had a few ideas and then just had to slog through. And I figured things out as best I could. And then when my youngest, so I have 7 children, and when my youngest was around 10 years old, blogging was actually becoming a thing. And along the way, people had always said to me, I mean, I am a very loquacious person. I'm a very talkative person. I'm a very opinionated person. And people always would say to me, you should write a book. And part of me, I would think, well, what do I know? I mean, it really annoys me when people who don't really know what they're talking about write books, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I did have the urge, but I just had a lot of children, and I didn't think that it was actually correct for me to take time away from my children to write. However, when my youngest was around 10 and blogging was a thing, I realized this was the format that was uniquely suited to me because it was quick, and I had at that time, I mean, fortunately, my youngest, who's now a grown woman, is very self-sufficient and was doing her own thing, and so I'd snatch little bits and bobs of time, and really my motivation was that I do have something to say, and that I wanted to save women from making all the mistakes that I made. And I wanted to say, these are the things you need to know and nobody is telling you. And so that's what motivated me to write. And I thought, well, this blogging thing, the posts could be kind of like a rough draft, but I don't know, would take forever to come up with something that would be any kind of book. And then about 8 or 10 years later, it was, came to the point of, wow, I think I really should put all this into a book. And then it was just a vast amount of material that took a long time to collate and organize. But then I ultimately did. And that is my book, De Summa Domestica. And really it is not, so it's really 2 parts. This is kind of my whole, the thrust of what it is that I have to say has to do with, first of all, very practical matters, because I really think that people end up getting embroiled in abstractions and even ideologies simply because they don't have the practical knowledge to do things, and so they give up, and then they fill the vacuum with ideas that I don't think they really even believe in. And if they find that, at least this is, I mean, not everybody is the same, but this is how it was for me, that when I actually became competent in certain areas, then I found I loved to do them and I loved my place. I was reconciled to my place. But then the other thing is to try to provide a real basis for why, from a philosophical, even theological point of view, for why it is that the woman is the one who makes the home, the importance of the home, the importance of motherhood, the dynamic between the husband and the wife, and all of that. And I really wanted to articulate that because I always came up against the question, well, what, and again, born out of the frustration of not being competent, but the question always arises, why do I have to be the one who does this? The woman is saying, why does it have to be me? Here I am alone. I'm alone with these irrational creatures who are so demanding, and why does it have to be me? It doesn't seem fair. And so that is the question that I really did want to answer on a very deep level. So that's basically how I got to write this, book.
So essentially, you had a practical side, and you kind of started the blog with that, but you also wanted a more philosophical underpinning, like a philosophy of motherhood. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
To answer that question that is burning in everybody's mind, not just women, men. And I start the book with this. I start the book with sort of a scenario that's very true to life that happened to me, of being at a party and having a young man say to me, well, why should it be the woman who stays home? And me just looking at him and say, well, do you have breasts? Can you nurse a baby? And then him saying, well, but that only lasts for a short amount of time. And thinking, well, does it? Is that true? You just have one or two children. You figure, well, I'll just devote, not even devote, but begrudge this couple of years, and then I'll be on with what's more important. Or is there something more? Is there something more to it than that? Can we have a generous idea versus a crabbed and put upon idea? So those kinds of things I really try to flesh out.
Mhm. And so then what brought you specifically to examining Casti Connubii, which eventually resulted in this book?
So one thing that I noticed over the years, and this comes out of personal experience as well, is that people really do not have the right understanding of what marriage is, of what the truth of marriage is. And in part, this is actually, and this is a very controversial thing for me to say, but this is actually exacerbated by Humanae Vitae, because Humanae Vitae was an encyclical from Paul VI at a crisis point in the life of the church to affirm a teaching of the church, although it is really just a precept of natural law, that contraception is sinful. And that's fine as far as it goes, although I would even question whether it was opportune for him to write about it at that time. But what's more important for my purposes is that the overall tone of Humanae Vitae is, first of all, he really doesn't delve into what marriage is in that encyclical. And the overall tone is very much of child avoidance. And that, and like what the licit ways of admitting that there are licit ways to avoid children, and that there are reasons for that, and that the woman, and he explicitly says that women in our time have a different role. And I really questioned that, and I really questioned whether people reading that or reading things written by people, theologians and prelates or what have you, who were formed in the Vatican II era and in the Humanae Vitae era, really have the right idea of what marriage is. And a friend of mine, a very dear friend, I mean, really my best friend, over the years, she would always say to me, this friend, she has 10 children, and she would always say to me, you should really read Casti Connubii. You need to read Casti Connubii. And I would always say, okay, well, whatever. I don't have time for that or whatever. And then one day I just said, you know what? I just really need to read Casti Connubii. She's right. She's been telling me this for decades, and now is the time. And on the blog, I did occasionally do readings of books. So we had various, if I thought a book was, I do what I want on my blog. And so I just thought, there's times that I think this is a book everybody should read. And after discussing Casti Connubii in a book group with some very good friends, upon whom I saw that had a tremendous impact, in the case of one of my friends, I saw that it actually changed her whole outlook towards her marriage. And she told me that it really changed everything. And including her attitude towards children. I decided that I would take the ideas that had come out of this little private book club and put them on my blog in the form of a book club. So over the ensuing weeks, I just took the sections of Casti Connubii little by little and went through them and tried to say, why is this important? It seems like a really dusty old volume that nobody would really care about, but let's go ahead and read it together. And so the tone of it reflects that, because I am really trying to write it in the hopes that people would form book clubs, hopefully couples would form book clubs. And this, in fact, did happen. And I have many letters and comments from people who said, they did do that. They had book clubs in their parish. I have priests who buy it wholesale and give it to their engaged couples. And so that was one thing, just in general, just saying we need to discuss what this is, because this encyclical attempts, Pius XI attempts to present what the church has taught about marriage from time immemorial, which is something that subsequent encyclicals did not do. Now, another impetus for me was the knowledge that Pope Francis was going to have a synod on the family. And I had been very involved when John Paul II had his synod on the family in the 80s. Mm-hmm. That was, I was a young married woman then. I lived in Washington, D.C. All our friends were young conservative Catholics. And that was even in our parish, the young dynamic priest who was assigned there wanted to talk about it with the parishioners. So that was something and that synod ultimately resulted in the apostolic letter Familiaris Consortio. And so that was something that had been very much on my mind. And for me, that was an alive document from the recent past, but actually it's quite a while ago. And time has flowed for everyone. And it made me anxious to think, now when Pope Francis announced this, by now we had gotten to know him a bit. We had gotten to know his let's make a mess attitude towards things. And it made me anxious to think, what is he going to do in this synod? And would the bishops, I don't put any trust in the bishops' knowledge. I don't think that they themselves study these things in any depth, and they seem to pride themselves on basing everything that they teach on Vatican II and everything subsequent to Vatican II, which means that even the conservative ones will reference Humanae Vitae, but nothing before that, and Humanae Vitae itself does not reference very much before itself. So when I started thinking about this synod on the family, I thought, all the more reason. It's almost an act of defiance. Like, let's dig up this this document from the past.
This inconvenient document, almost,
Exactly. Like, it is. This is. Chesterton says, and I quote him in the book. The Christian basically has the right and duty to go through the centuries and rummage around and pull out what is helpful. And I kind of, in a very resistant attitude, really wanted to do that and to say, let's go through this. And the thing is that Pius XI, if you read, if a person reads Casti Connubii, if a person reads his book on Christian education, you are really struck by the careful organization, the unfolding of the ideas in a sequential form, and the depth of knowledge of history and of natural law. And he brings all that, and he puts it all on the table. But in the case of Casti Connubii, he is eloquent and really inspiring precisely about the beauty of marriage. He paints a picture that is so really, I can only say it's just inspiring. He shows what God's plan is for marriage and how really glorious it is, and how embedded in our very natures it is. So we are used to talking about John Paul II and theology of the body, and John Paul II often talks about the nuptial meaning of the body. But for for the reader of Pius XI, all of that becomes much more vivid, and he's much more convinced and much more, even more convincing of the importance of marriage in the economy of salvation. And so I did really think that this was an important thing to study, to grapple with, and to really just I'm almost saying I'm forcing you, just like my friend forced me, like in the gentlest way possible, but you really have to read this. So that's what I tried to do.
Yeah. So that's very interesting, because in your book, you mention the right to retain freedom to reference and use previous doctrine, the teaching of the church in the past. And in the context of the church's traditional teaching on marriage, obviously, on the one hand, we have explicit contradictions of her perennial teaching, like opening the door to divorce. But sort of in this context of speaking about how Pius XI presents marriage in a more holistic way, would you say, than maybe even John Paul II? What would you say about the shift from the theology of Pius XI and sort of that preceding him to more personalism, as exemplified by Alice and Dietrich von Hildebrand and John Paul II? I wonder, in the sense, like, what were people being told 150 years ago in marriage prep? Not even in the sense that marriage prep didn't really exist in the same way, but a simpler approach, presumably a more historical approach, especially on personal fulfillment and marital intimacy. Couldn't these have something helpful to contribute to our reflection on the topic? How is it that we've lost? We've lost, in a sense, a historical viewpoint.
Yeah, I think that to a large extent this was on purpose, that people in the 20th century said we need a new, fresh way of looking at things, and I'm all for that. I think it's a paradox, it's a tension. You can't just say we can only talk about things in the traditional way, and you can't say we can only talk about things in a new way. You have to always be alive to how people are talking about things and what would strike them, but you have to also keep in mind what has been given, especially if you're Pope. That's kind of your that is your actual mission, is to guard what has been given. I want to say, before you can remind me to get back to your question, but I want to just quickly say that a thing to keep very much in mind is that when Pius XI wrote Casti Connubii, he himself was in 1930, and it was a response to a crisis. It wasn't just, let me sit down and just write down about the beauties of marriage. It was like, there is a serious cataclysmic attack on something given by God at the very beginning of humanity. And that attack took the form of the most, it was two things, the most respectable form of Protestantism, we can say, Anglicanism, have the Anglicans coming together, having their own, synod with a small s, and saying that contraception is acceptable between married couples, which had never been accepted or articulated by any Protestant up until that time. So that was, for us now today, it's hard for us to understand how dire of a situation that was, but it was truly a rift in Christendom and in Christianity. And the second thing was the rise of Margaret Sanger and the rise of the ideology of birth control. And so those two things, plus I truly believe that he saw what was coming in Europe. Like I think he did know that the ideologies of communism and National Socialism were shortly gonna be not only a challenge for people in terms of a coming war, but would attack their minds. And I think that he saw all that, and so he presciently and prophetically wrote this encyclical. And people talk about Humanae Vitae as being prophetic. That's something that we hear all the time. But if you compare the two documents, I think that there's no question that Casti Connubii is vastly more prophetic in terms of
But in what way, though, do people say that Humanae Vitae is prophetic? Because, I mean, if you look at the discussions that were happening on the issue of contraception in the 60s, in a sense, Paul VI just punted for years and years on a question that was, in a sense, crystal clear.
It's just that in the encyclical, he does say that if people accept contraception, that there would be a real denigration of the human person, and that abortion would become accepted. But the truth is that Pius XI was saying that in 1930. So, and says very much more. And I think that because of the dissent and difficulties and anxiety caused by wondering whether the Pope would stand up for these matters that you refer to, I think that people almost overreact to the fact that he did uphold a certain core teaching in the encyclical, and so they do praise it very highly. I just have difficulties with some of the things in it, and that's a subject for, I don't know, I do feel like that's a book that someday I'm going to have to grapple with and get down to and write. But suffice it to say that, people in their relief that he did uphold this important principle that contraception is simply wrong, took the truthful things, but not, he didn't emphasize them, and they just make them into a sort of prophecy. And all I'm trying to say is that when you read Casti Connubii, the prophetic nature of it is actually much stronger, especially considering the time period, which you would think was much more stable than what you had in the 60s. So anyway, just to say that those were the challenges, those were the crises that he saw bearing down, and that is what prompted him to write. And but then, you said, you characterized it as, he's presenting this teaching that is very traditional and very complete, and then there's in the later time period, we have something that's much more personalistic, much more individualistic, much more based on psychology, and as I said, I think that shift happened because people were just searching for new ways to put things. I do think that there was a subversiveness that so the church, and even beyond the church, even just philosophy, natural law, ancient philosophy, shows and demonstrates that the purpose of marriage is procreation. That is its reason for existence. And Thomas Aquinas talks about how marriage elevates and sanctifies this natural, it's just a natural aspect of life to want to reproduce. That's just something that is what it means to be alive, is to reproduce. You take in nourishment and you reproduce. That's the definition, really, of life: movement and nourishment, taking in nourishment and reproducing. But for the human being, marriage is the elevation of what is just merely a natural process, but nevertheless the ends are still there. So the primary end of marriage is procreation, and of course the means is unity. It's not just physical unity, it's a unity. And in Genesis we read the two become one flesh. That's something that's embedded in our understanding of the phenomenon that's given to us in the very description of creation. So there's these two aspects, but the primary one is procreation. But it's
The two aspects of, on the one hand, our Lord says, God says to Adam, or says of Adam, it is not good for man to be alone. But then Eve comes on the scene and he says, go and fill the earth, multiply and fill the earth.
The two are intrinsic to each other. But insofar as we can, you can have two books on a table and the one rests on the other, and the one that upon which the other is resting is the primary one, and that is procreation. Well, even in the proceedings of Vatican II, there was a meeting, and Cardinal Swindens talked to some of the other council fathers, and basically said, we're just gonna go ahead and just, good news, we're going to be able to shed this whole procreation idea, and we'll just be able to focus on the unitive. So even at that point, long before Humanae Vitae, you have long before the personalism, and and I think John Paul II, if you really read him and not what is just simply written about what he wrote, he does definitely emphasize the procreative in his theology of the body books, not so much love and responsibility, but which he wrote before he was Pope, so it doesn't carry quite the same weight. But anyway, there is, as you say, this kind of new theological approach, and really it's kind of like, okay, but it just doesn't take into account human nature, because the truth is that there's all kinds of marriages. Marriage is an objective fact. It is an objectively one flesh union of two people, and it is objectively ordered to procreation. And so no matter what the feelings are, no matter how fulfilling this marriage is or how unfulfilling it is objectively a marriage, and it has these characteristics. And to emphasize these other things, which are true and good and can enhance people's understanding and can be helpful in many ways, but to emphasize them to the exclusion of the objective aspects ends up really destabilizing the whole.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because Dietrich and Alice von Hildebrand, who are in somewhat, the really big names in that movement, they never had any children themselves for whatever reason.
Yeah, they were just older. She was older when they got married, yes. And she certainly would have, I'm sure she would have had children had she not been older. Right. And by the way, she's very much a bulwark against the popularizers of John Paul II, particularly Christopher West, who end up taking things to such a ridiculous, crazy exaggeration. And she really ends up standing for a much more traditional way of looking at marriage. But it's true that, so Dietrich had children from his previous marriage. His wife died, but he and Alice did not. But they were academics. They were very abstract. They like to think about things, and that's great. Like, people think about things, they come up with ideas, good for them. But really, that's not, theologians were not in the Garden of Eden. Theologians did not give us our understanding. God himself gave us our understanding of what marriage is. And all we have to do, and that is what people forget, that's what John Paul II does in his theology of the body. He goes back to Genesis and he talks about it. That's all we have to do, just go back to Genesis and look at it, and it's all there. And that is what Pius XI is talking about, but he is talking about it with the wisdom of everything the church has learned along the way over the centuries, and really explicating so carefully and yet so lovingly what this relationship is, and particularly what it means for the children, and how if you destabilize it, it will end up harming the woman, it will harm the children, and so you really need to not destabilize it.
So you repeatedly use the word blunt to describe Pius XI's encyclical. I just wonder, is that really fair? Is it really true to say that the traditional teaching on marriage, which is beautiful and harmonious if properly understood and explained, is somehow rough? Or maybe it's just rough to us sort of soft, modern people who've been pampered and, have everything is ordered to how we feel. And, what do you think on that idea?
Personally, I like people to speak bluntly and say what is on their minds and not soft pedal things. When I discussed this with my friends, and also there were comments on the post, there were just particular places that presented problems. And I will say that as I have studied more about encyclicals and about papal teaching, I have come to realize that we can we must take the things that are true in them and make them our own. We don't have to love every single form that they come in, every sentence. We don't have to take things. There can be just there can even be infelicities of expression, and there can be things that are imprudent to say. We don't have to take everything as if it's coming. If Pope Francis has taught us anything, it's we don't have to take everything as if it's an oracle from God. Now, if there are some popes we trust more than others, for sure, and I tried to give Pius XI the benefit of the doubt. I think there were a couple of places, and I do have a chapter called Two Tough Bits. The one thing that he says that really was difficult for women to accept, and I get it, was when he said that to answer people who belittle the idea that we must keep procreation within the bonds of marriage. This is on page 138, 139. He says in paragraph 50, he says that it's as though to suggest that the license of a base fornicating woman should enjoy the same rights as the chaste motherhood of a lawfully wedded wife. And the thing is, well, just to speak of, the license of a base fornicating woman, it's just harsh from the mouth of a man. It's harsh. And one thing that I would like men to see is that if they want to have authority, they have to accept responsibility. With authority comes responsibility. So if there is a base fornicating woman, there is an even more base fornicating man. And the truth is that he really does not address that in this encyclical. And I do think that at some point, someone has to say all that. I don't know, I kind of dread that it might have to be me. However, the truth of what he's saying here is undeniable. And in our time, when we are coming to the point where almost as many children across the board are born out of wedlock as are born in wedlock, and for some races, it is vastly more that are born out of wedlock. We have to confront the fact that being a chaste, lawfully wedded wife is almost denigrated, and that the base fornicating woman is somehow held to be higher, and that the poorest people in our society, the poorest people, are the large families where the husband is working hard and there's one income and the mom is home taking care of all the children. They're actually living according to the actual plan of God, to be open to life, to have as many children as God sends. And very often, and I lived through this myself, you're the poorest. And the woman, the base fornicating woman who's having children out of wedlock is getting welfare support. They're even writing letters to the newspaper complaining that they have to buy clothes, at Walmart when everybody else is shopping at the mall. And it's like, wait a second. And I mean, I've been in that situation where I was reading such a comment and thinking, hold on, like, we are actually paying taxes. I don't get welfare. Our clothes come from bags that people leave on our back porch because they're taking pity on me. I don't shop anywhere. And yet, like, this is what he's talking about. So the language is rough, it's incomplete, but yet there is a truth to this. And the further truth is that where there is unchastity, the woman will bear the consequences of it. And that's just a truth that women have to face. Women don't like facing it. They want to say that it shouldn't be that way. And you can say that you think things shouldn't be a certain way. That doesn't mean that that's not how they are. So I do really go through that in this chapter. I really delve into why he says this. And then there's just, the other part that's just so hard to swallow. It's just tough. Is when he says the woman has to have trusting obedience, and she owes trusting obedience to the man. And then he says many of these critics go further and assert that such a subjection of one party to the other is unworthy of human dignity, and that the rights of husband and wife are equal, wherefore they boldly proclaim the emancipation of women has been or ought to be effected. And then comes the most beautiful passage. So this one I don't apologize for at all. I think he's just, he's just stating it, and you, the reader, who's likely to be a soft feminist who just doesn't like to think about this, takes it hard. But at the same time, it's just something that we have to confront. And he says that if the woman descends from her truly regal throne, to which she has been raised within the walls of the home by means of the gospel, she will soon be reduced to the old state of slavery, if not in appearance, certainly in reality, and become, as amongst the pagans, and the mere instrument of man. And that was really hard for my readers to swallow. But the truth is that we take it for granted that women will have a somewhat elevated position in society, even though we always give lip service to the feminist trope that women are always oppressed. But we act as if we will be treated with dignity. But actually, a woman being treated with dignity represents the pinnacle of Christian civilization, something so easily lost. And then the descent to paganism, where women are denigrated and actually made slaves, is so quick. And that is where we are right now, and nobody even notices it. So this is what I mean by his prophecy, is that he says things, we're so blinded by feminist rhetoric that we don't see it, but we are literally living in an age that was unthinkable. Even 20 years ago, that women would be paid to have their wombs for rent. This is trafficking in human flesh, surrogacy, and it is part of our everyday culture now. And it's slavery. It's just simply slavery. And he kind of called it. And so I kind of just say, well, you might think that I'm not necessarily saying that I think everything he says is tough and blunt. I do have to acknowledge that people do see it that way. And so I'm just trying to,
Sure.
say, like, no,
Sure.
we got to listen. We got to listen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then maybe sort of getting into another of your themes in this book on the beauty of femininity and womanhood. In some of your writings, you also bring attention to Pius XII, Pius XI's successor, and his allocution to midwives, in which he says that it is your duty to cause the young mother to enjoy less by your words than by your whole manner of acting, The greatness, beauty, and nobility of that life which begins is formed and it lives in her womb, the child which she bears in her arms and suckles at her breast, to make shine in her eyes and heart the great gift of God's love for her and her child. Um, and I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on this idea of motherhood as a way of discovering one's femininity and womanhood, and as motherhood being a cure for a sort of soft or semi-feminist tendencies.
If women can overcome the brainwashing, I mean, it's just simple brainwashing that we have undergone. And I mean, I'm a grandma. I've got all this gray hair, but it started, when I was a child, the whole push, I mean, and even my father was Egyptian. He was from Egypt. He was Muslim, and you are going to get a degree. You are going to have a career. He did not let up for a second. And I know that I was a sore disappointment to him because I didn't do that. So this has been going on for a long time. And if a woman can listen to her heart and allow herself to embrace motherhood, then she will discover things about herself, and including strengths that have been hidden, and it's like a knowledge that's been hidden from her. And I really do encourage people to read that Pius XII's Elocution to Midwives. It sounds kind of random. It sounds like, well, why would I read something that he said to midwives? But it's so beautiful. It's in so many dimensions. I mean, so many things, just even what a midwife is, that the place that a midwife ought to have in society, and that in our society she's just pretty much completely lost. I mean, we're all about doctors. We don't really think about and again, it's a profession of women, but it's a helping profession. It's an outgrowth of what it means to be a woman, and it is a very beautiful and deep thing. As he expresses there, it gives the woman who is working in this area the opportunity to encourage, and any woman who has been under the care, quote unquote, of a professional for obstetrics and gynecology can tell you how easy it is for someone to, and I mean, men and women. I've had this happen to me in the hands of obstetricians and of nurses, it's being made to feel unworthy, worthless, like what you are doing, giving birth to a child, is an imposition. It's so easy for the person, the woman, the mother, to lose her sense of self and dignity. And the person helping her, which, in this case, it's the midwife, does have the power, because of the intimacy of the relationship, to help the woman. And this is how women, we hear, feminism bandies about the idea of sisterhood, but this is true sisterhood, is women helping each other to, in this intimate way, to know that there is a true femininity, and that it is expressed in motherhood, and that the woman will find and recover her femininity in having children. And as St. Paul says, woman is saved by childbirth. And that is, John Paul II wrote very beautifully in his letter to women about spiritual motherhood. And even a woman who can't have children, or a woman who has dedicated herself to a life of virginity, still does participate in a very real and elevated way in this motherhood and femininity. And that passage from St. Paul, the fathers teach us, really refers to Our Lady. And so much of what everything that we learn about motherhood ultimately is found in her. And that is something that comes through in Casti Connubii, and that is not really discussed in Humanae Vitae or in our time in general. The exaltation of Our Lady, the beauty of her motherhood, the refinement of her femininity, which, by the way, is also expressed as strength. One of her titles is as an army arrayed for battle. We can't forget that. So all of that is just, it's almost lost. So that was another reason that I just felt I had to write about these things.
Mhm. So if a sense of femininity and motherhood can be lost in the direction of feminism, obviously this is, the other direction is what might be a very much more minor consideration, but something I just wanted to bring up and ask you. You know, one certainly hears the stereotype of the mousy, sheltered homeschooler, so floating around sometimes. And, I think it's true. I was homeschooled myself, and I've met a lot of other homeschoolers. Occasionally, you do meet people who fit the stereotype. Most of the time, people who meet homeschoolers are, surprised at how normal they are. Uh, but you certainly have the mousy homeschooler happens occasionally, and it's certainly a stereotype in people's minds. Do you think that for some girls from such uh, sheltered backgrounds, there's the danger of having an underdeveloped sense of their womanhood or their feminine sexuality, which could prevent them from being mature mothers or wives?
It's funny because, I can only probably really speak about the homeschoolers of my family and of the ones I know in my pretty large homeschooling group, and of the ones I have met in the Catholic colleges that I've been connected to. And I think that an upbringing that is respectful of natural law and of the roles of girls and boys and men and women will ultimately be better for the purposes of being able to find a spouse and have and become a mother, and the ones and a father, and the ones I have seen, now I have seen, because I'm older now, I've seen, there are now, I still look at them and think of them as kids, and they're mothers of large families because I've known them for so long. Sometimes I look at them and think, you're getting married, really? Or you're having your seventh child, really? Because you're the age of one of my children. Time is passing. And I'd say that a greater problem than sheltering one's children, I think it's actually important to shelter one's children. What I see is, and this can spill over into the whatever you want to call it, homeschooling or conservative Christian Catholic circles, but I see it much more in the conventional world, is the kind of deadening or callousness that comes about when basically good children are forced to grow up very much in contact with members of the opposite sex on a regular basis. And this is something that, this is not related to what I wrote, but Pius XI in his encyclical on Christian education has a long section where he talks about the importance of single-sex education and the dangers of co-education. And it's really worth reading. It goes against all of our modern sensibilities. But the truth is that, and it's actually an article by a rabbi that alerted me to this, is that where there is enforced closeness between the sexes, especially in the adolescent time period, there can arise in the basically good, decent kids, a wall, a protection that from the inside. So this is as opposed to the family offering protection from the outside and saying, we'll make sure that you're not constantly in the company of the opposite sex, but it's then from the inside. And I think that creates difficulties, because it ends up that the kids are so used to being thrown together in intimate situations that they don't know how to be romantic, and they don't know how to express their sexuality, because they're so used to you could say, like, tamping it down just to survive. And this article by this rabbi was so interesting. The comment that he made when he said something about, like, to his nephew, I think it was, well, you're going on a camping trip. I can't remember exactly what the article was, but it was something to the effect of, well, you're going on that camping trip with girls, and the kid was like, yeah, I mean, we're together all the time. I even sleep in sleeping bags with my cousins. It's no big deal. Like, and the rabbi was really shocked and was kind of like, this is not good news, because when the time comes, you're not going to be able to just quickly switch around to, now I see you as a sexual being. Like, in a way, you're kind of beating that out of yourself. And I think there's a lot of just common sense to that. And I think that what we have in our hypersexualized society, where everything it's just, we're just bombarded all the time, is that, yeah, there's a kind of like natural reticence, but because it has to be ratcheted up so high all the time, it's hard to wind it back again. And I think that, of course, there can be prudery, and prudery is a big mistake. And this is why, actually, like the passage that you read from the Allocution to Midwives, that particular passage I love, because he talks about nursing the babies. And I think that, we have actually become super duper prudes about things like mothers nursing their babies, where if you read, if you look at the Renaissance and medieval pictures, there's breasts everywhere and mothers nursing their babies. And if you read, I was reading St. Francis de Sales on the love of God, his treatise on the love of God, and he has images of nursing babies as images of the love of God throughout the entire treatise. So I think we need to, yes, we certainly need to be careful that we don't become prudes. So there has to be that balance. It's always a tension. It's always a paradox. It's a kind of balance that we have to strike, and we have to be to and natural, and also respect intimacy, not bandy about with all sorts of tropes and ideas that, we have to be, have courtesy, and yet, yeah, not make it so that everything seems bad and wrong. That would not be good either.
Are you familiar with C.S. Lewis's book, The Four Loves?
Yes.
And so in there he has a particularly intriguing section where he talks about the importance of, in some sense, keeping sex humorous and not making it over serious and over sacralized. That seems to be similar to what you're saying.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. As your book concludes, you speak about the fact that we can do something in our own families in spite of the global crisis of family. This resonated very much with a piece I recently published on Crisis Magazine, The Universal Call to Hobbitness. But in your book, you said, God made reality so that a man who humbly does an unpleasant job for the sake of his family is in fact the real lord of the manor. A man of no account can yet be the builder of a rich culture and the sower of prosperous fields. And I couldn't agree more. And I wondered, is there anything you'd like to add to this thought? Maybe especially in your reflection since you published God Has No Grandchildren, and as the crisis of family has grown ever more intense, and in a way it seems that more and more it's only within our homes that we can do anything.
Everything, the family is the domestic church, and that isn't just a pious little kind of analogy. It's a reality. It's a reality that comes from the church fathers, and it really does have to do with the fact that marriage is a sacrament, and that the sacramental grace is alive in the relationship between the husband and the wife. And so the family really is a church, just in the same way that there's sacramental grace. I mean, the Eucharist is the primary, the foremost, and the fount and the summit of the sacraments. But just as the sacramental grace happens on the altar and the church is the place where that happens, the sacramental grace is happening in union with that between the husband and the wife. It's not something that happens on the day of their wedding and then kind of fizzles out. It's something that is happening through, when they are in this state of grace, it is the medium through which they move, and the home is the place where that sacramental grace is contained. And so, I say this in my other book, that the marital bed is the altar of this sacrament. Like, the husband and the wife should regard this place as truly a locus of their union in much more than a physical way. And the wife should take care of her room, and the bed should be regarded as something, really sacred. And the family dinner table is another place where this sacramental grace is warming the hearts of everybody who is collected around it. And so in this way, there is just something that this is where life is going to be revived. And again, in union with what it is that is happening in the church, and it is where the rubber hits the road, and it is so important for us to reclaim this. And one reason that we don't, or that we have difficulty, is because of the denigration of the nature and the perfections of man and woman, respectively. And because we see both men and women as kind of cogs in this, grand economic machine, and that the woman should just be able to, go out and make just as much money as the man, and that's her worth in society. And I mean, one of the big things that I had to write about in the book is, how does a woman who wants to do something for society reconcile life in the home? But it's only if you see her role as an economic unit that you see any tension. If you realize that the perfection of her nature is to not only make a place, but to be a place, that you realize that the home then takes on this incredible meaning. And I talk about woman as being a place, because this is how we talk about Our Lady. We talk about her as the Ark of the Covenant. We talk about her as a vessel. We talk about, she has all these names, and she really is the home, the place where goodness can be and be safe. And the woman is made to be this way. This is her perfection. So there's so many things that flow from that. Likewise, the man is made to act and to do and to conquer and to strive, and most of all, to be the protector and the provider. And he does that for her and for the world and for his children. And these two roles are complementary. And this complementarity is something that we have almost completely lost. So when, I love the title, your Hobbit title, and the beautiful reflection on the littleness of hobbits, and the value of that life, that hidden life. And even where we see people doing grand things, and mostly it is men who do the grand things, have the grand gestures, and produce the grand things. There are women who do so as well. But what we find, if we really look at it honestly, is that they are free to do those things because there is a place for them to rest. And just as the Sunday is 1/7 of our week, um, and yet it is the thing that gives meaning. It is the day and the time that gives meaning to everything else. So the place of rest of the home is what gives meaning to everything else. And we see this more in a negative way, that where, I don't know if you're familiar with a book by the psychiatrist, the German psychiatrist Carl Stern. He wrote a book called Flight from Woman, and he very interestingly looks at modernism and philosophers who had a huge impact, like Descartes, and artists in the modern era. And he really locates their error in, I mean, he's a psychiatrist. He's looking at everything psychologically, but he's a Jew who converted to Catholicism. And he says, in every case, there is the lack of a mother. And so really, even the person's philosophy stems from this lack, this flight from woman, and he correlates womanhood with intuition, with seeing things whole, with being, with contemplation, which I think we see resolved in Our Lady. So all of this to say that I do think that the home is that that thing that is too small to fail, the thing that we read about in the gospel, that the hidden seed that falls to the ground, and that is responsible. If we look at really the history of salvation, we see that that it is the mothers and the fathers who make it all happen. And this is what we have to get back to. We have to stop devaluing all of that and realize its glory and be willing to devote ourselves to it. The woman has to be willing to be hidden and devoted to the home and her children and her husband and her marriage, and the man has to be willing to fight in order to protect and provide.
Mm-hmm. And so I suppose with this sort of more restored, vision of the home, and as more Catholic communities, as more healthy Catholic families form, to what extent would you say that a correct vision of womanhood, domesticity, even fatherhood also, is something that each person has to discover from themselves? Or is it, yes, I mean, I would certainly say that it's also something that can be learned from a good environment. But it also seems like you want to say that there is something that each person has to discover there for themselves. Could you comment on that?
It's built into our nature, and we need to accept certain things as givens. We can't function if we don't accept certain things as givens. We just are made. The human being is given as man and woman. That is how we are made. There's no escaping it. And it's kind of like, in the gospel when our Lord says, agree with your adversary quickly. It's just better not to fight against it, because once we accept, the first given is that we exist. And right now we see the fight against existence. Well, there's no end to that. It ends other than suicide and murder. So let's not go there. Let's accept it. Let's accept that we were made from nothing. There's no consent. We just came into being. And we came into being because we had a mother and a father. And we also have to accept our nature. Our nature as a man. Now listen, I am a super spirited woman. I have the irascible temperament. I am not like a docile woman by any means. So I relate to the women who, are struggling with that. But if we can see it, if that's why I always do return to that image of Our Lady as an army arrayed for battle, because this speaks to, and as I say in my took the Summa Domestica. There are someone who just accept, they're just like, hey, I'm just going to be a mom and I'm going to be home and I'm going to raise my children. I'm going to be happy. And then there's other women who are fighters and they just can't really accept it that easily. But if we see that this is part of our nature and this is the nature of Our Lady, and that we can go to her and if we can just accept it, we'll find the glories and the beauties. And then we realize that there would be nothing without women in homes. This is what we're finding out. This is the world. Go step outside and see. There is no one on the street. There is no one in the neighborhood. There is no one. You can't let a child run around, as is his nature, to just run around and climb trees and whatever, because there's no one to knock on your door and say, did you know that your kid fell out of the tree? There's no one. This is what happens when we abandon our homes, is that then we have to have the state come in and say, well, now we'll take care of your kids for you, and now your kid is sick. Well, you can't take care of your kid at home because you're working, so we'll put your kid in a sick daycare or whatever. And all of this, it's all a result of the woman abandoning the very great task of providing all of that. So yeah, it's actually a huge challenge. It's actually should appeal to the spirited quality in the spirited woman. And likewise for the man, he should want to fight for that, and he should not want to lord it over his wife, and that would be a terrible temptation and an error to think that would be some sort of traditional way of looking at things. His role is to fight for that and to realize that the virtue of his wife is what will give him virtue, because being an authority does not necessarily mean that you have virtue by any means. So it's the virtue of the wife that gives the man his fulfillment. All that's required of him is to be willing to fight for her, and all of the rest will be given to him. So yeah, that's the way we'll climb our way back. I'm not sure exactly what your question was to start with, but that is what I see, the vision that I see.
For sure. And so then maybe as just like a final question, and also sort of following up to what you were just saying there, what would you have any advice or thoughts that you would want to offer young men and women as they approach dating or courting, from the point of view of this traditional holistic approach to the roles of men and women?
So I think that we say this to our daughters is, think of yourself as a princess surrounded by a thorn hedge, and rely on your parents or some trusted mentor to be the gatekeeper and to help you. And to our sons, to say, seek out a virtuous woman and show your chivalry by being willing to talk to her dad and to show that you are above board. And I think that we can trust in the nature that God gave us, and be open to the normal things of just attraction and so on, and yet be marriage minded, so that we're not throwing our pearls before swine, or we're not entering into any affections before we see that the person could be worthy of it. And certainly to have in mind, there's no point in dating if you don't think that the person is marriage worthy. But at the same time, you should be able to have fun and go out with your friends, and and be able to, dare I say, flirt a little bit, and just yeah, have a good time. I mean, it's that, it's difficult because now words have a very different meaning, and we're in an era where even for Christians, um, somehow the cart is before the horse, and there's a lot of just assumption about sexual activity before marriage, and really do need to recover um, an, a better way of looking at that, and that requires recovering a vocabulary, and that's probably too much that to go into right now. But I think to just say, where do I want to be in 5 years? And I just want to marry for the point of view of the guy, like, I want to marry a woman who is warm and will be a good mother. And from the point of view of the woman, to say, I need a man who's going to stand up for me and protect my kids and be a good father. And I have to like him, and I have to like her, and I have to see a spark. And yeah, like, let's just try
I
to
mean,
recover a normal way of doing things, a more healthy
right.
way.
And so, I mean, in that sense, it's very simple.
Yeah,
It's not. This is not rocket science. Uh,
no. I mean, if we just simply accept that sex belongs in marriage, period, everything becomes very simple. Then you're just free. You're free to just get to know the person. You're free to take a walk. You're free to hold hands. You're free to talk things over, and then, yeah, and to keep your integrity. And if it turns out it's not the right person, then you're just, nothing bad has happened, and you're free to go on and find somebody who is the right person. Pray to Saint Joseph. He is the great protector. I always pray to Saint Joseph for my children, and whenever a young gal writes to me, and I've even had some gentlemen write to me about finding a spouse, I always say, pray to Saint Joseph, go to Saint Joseph. He is the protector of young people and of the family, and he will find someone for you.
awesome. Well, thank you very much for sharing all of this with us, Lila. And for our readers who want to delve into these topics more, would there be any other books that you'd particularly recommend as high on your list of where to go next?
So I do recommend another book that I wrote, the little oratory. I wrote that with David Clayton. It's very important that the Christian have a prayer life, and the prayer life there should be something in the home that helps us pray, and that is the little icon corner or prayer table. And so we talk about how to make that in your home. I do think that is a very important traditional way to jumpstart and keep your prayer life going. And also, it just has a huge effect on the life of a Christian to have a place in the home to pray, of beauty, a place of beauty. And yeah, I mean, I think that reading Casti Connubii is a really important thing to do. I have, I don't think that I have anything in particular to recommend right now, although I do have recommendations in the Summa Domestica for things to read. And I even have a whole section on the woman preparing herself with fundamental reading for making a home. So
Excellent. And do you have any other publishing projects underway?
Well, in the back of my mind are simmering a few things. I'm a little, I have to kind of recover from the magnum opus. But certainly I do feel like something has to be written about feminism, because there is no good feminism. And I know I shock people when I say that, although it's getting to be less of a shock now than when I first started saying it about 10 years ago. So I think maybe people are ready. I'd like to maybe write a cookbook that is would be the Like Mother, Like Daughter cookbook, being able to make good food for large crowds, for all those babies that are going to sit around the table. And yeah, and then I don't know, but I'm also just enjoying knitting and sewing and not writing anything in particular.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed speaking about your works and your thoughts. And God Has No Grandchildren can be found on aroucapress.com and on Amazon and a number of other online sites. And we'll see you next time at Arouca Press Signposts podcast, episode number 2. Thank you.